Namaste. Sivananda Supatha Foundation, Bhimanipatnam, is devoted to take forward Sadguru Sivananda Murtiji's mission by publishing his speeches and writings and holding seminars, symposiums and conferences on various themes relating to Sanatana Dharma, Bharat culture and its history besides socio-cultural and spiritual topics. In pursuance of the above objectives, we organized an international symposium on reconstructing the cultural history of Bharat at Integral Institute of Advanced Management, Visakhapatnam, on February 18th and 19th, inviting reputed scholars from Bharat and abroad to enlighten us on various themes relating to the problems and perspectives in writing Bharat cultural history on truthful and purposeful lines. The erudite presentations of these scholars are presented in this channel. Kindly subscribe and encourage us in our endeavor to promote Sanatana Dharma.
Now may I request Sri Koenraad Elst to come over here and speak to us. We are not saying you will use them for anybody. Okay. Okay. Good. Yes. Namaste, Vanakkam, or whatever you say in Telugu. So, yes, we can't go into too much detail into the foreign literary sources, though very generally that's exactly what I will do. But you see, there's so much here from the time that Westerners started meddling in India till today. Recently you had all these fashions of deconstruction and postmodernism and so on. In fact, Indians have played quite a role in it, like Gayatri Spivak, for instance. So, I mean, this is all very interesting. I'd love to go into that. The day when I have a bit more time, now I want to focus on the most important things. Aha! I was just being taught what to do here, but I don't seem to find it. Here we go. Okay. Okay. So, looked at from India, I come from the northwest. So here you are at about 20 degrees north in latitude and about, 5 hours, 75, 80 degrees east, okay. And so Orientalism started mainly in France, Germany, Holland and England, which is about 0 to 10, 15 degrees east and about 50 degrees north, so that is to India's northwest. Now actually the northwest has a bad reputation in India. You see, it spells trouble. The first invasion described in the Rig Veda is from the Druhyus. They don't really invade from outside India, but they invade in the Vedic territory from a bit farther to the northwest. The Vedic territory was in Haryana. These people come from Punjab. And so they get defeated by Mandhata. Then within the Vedas you have a few battles, especially the Battle of the 10 Kings, which is of course to enemies from the northwest, namely the 10 Kings, defeated by King Sudas. In the Ramayana, Kaikeyi and her maid, who brings all the trouble, come from Kekeya, which is a country in West Punjab. Then in the Mahabharata, Gandhari, wrong spelling, Gandhari, that's her, and her brother Shakuni come again from the northwest. And then later all the invasions, you see, come from the Scythians, the Greeks, the Kushanas, the Huns, the Turks a number of times, and they all come from the northwest. You see, there was never any Indonesian invasion or Mauritian invasion or Australian invasion. So watch out for the Northwest. And therefore be very careful with anything I tell you. There might be a trap in it. Okay, so let's talk about the West and some literary approaches from the West. And I know that as a fairly loyal representative of this Western approach, I always end up in quarrels with Sanskritists. So, you know, Western methods, you know, literary analysis go back many centuries, but essentially they are considered as satisfying modern criteria of scholarship from about the mid-19th century. That was the time of the German universities of von Humboldt, who was considered as the founder of modern academe. And in our field, the aim was to reconstruct things, and I quote, as they really have been. That is Leopold von Ranke's definition of history. So he's considered the father of modern history, not the father of absolute history. That, you know, does they consider Herodotus, who wrote a book called The Histories, and until then the word history meant investigation. Okay, so this modern approach often clashes with the Itihasa Purana literature. Yet, both the names Itihasa and Purana suggest that they were actually doing something that we would recognize as history. So, yes, you see there are some rather strange, sometimes even science fiction type things in the epics, in the Puranas, but that is also true for history in Europe in the old days. You see, the histories of Herodotus are by no means history according to modern standards. You know, he also did a lot of hearsay and so on. There are stories that are really, you know, strange to believe, like about all the creatures that live in India. And so, you see, he did his best with the means he had at his disposal, but it was not modern history. And so the same counts for Itihasa, but, you know, that's no reason to say with, for instance, Raji Malhotra, that Itihasa is something fundamentally different from history. I disagree. Those writers who called their own writing Itihasa or Purana, Purana is antiquity. You see, in Roman literature, this is also a genre, antiquities. So, you know, old histories. They clearly explained that they wanted to do history, that they wanted to tell things as they really have been. That's more or less the meaning also in Sanskrit of Itihasa. Thus it really was. So what they did write down was essentially historical to start with. So when an important, impressive thing had happened, they felt a need to report this to the next generations. And so they wrote down what they remembered. Partly this was incomplete, sometimes even wrong, depended on the information they had. Partly also, you should take into account their bias. And that may already happen at the very first moment. You see, when a traffic accident happens, the police questions the bystanders, already you're going to have slightly different versions. You're going to recognize that they are describing the same event, yet it will not be everywhere the same. and let's say that a driver has caused a big accident and so on, among the bystanders is his mother, very probably she'll give a far more favorable version, favorable for him, than another bystander would. So you have to take all that into account. The objectivity is not absolutely guaranteed, but at any rate it's about a real event. And so today if you write or read just testimonies, or even heavy academic books written by professional historians, even then a bias may be present. So that's you can of course do your best to avoid that as much as possible, but it's going to be there. So this ancient core is quite true. You see, many secularists are going to say, oh no, Rama, that's all fantasy. Like I think the Congress party only a few years ago declared that Rama did not exist. Now, at some point it was fashionable to say that. Oh, did I do something? Please help. Yes. Ah, there it is. Thank you. Oh my God. What now? Yes. Okay, let's not play with this anymore. Okay. So in the 19th century, you had a period, like end of the 19th century, when it was, it looked good to poo-poo every tradition. And so, academics especially acted like, it's all fantasy. The ancient people had a lot of imagination, and they didn't have critical thinking and so on. So what they say is not worth much. For example, a big example of those days is the War of Troy. So, the scholar said, oh no, this is just a story. And an amateur, not a historian, namely the retired businessman Heinrich Schliemann, who had earned a lot so he could finance a real expedition, he sent an archaeological expedition to the site more or less indicated by the poet Homer, and they found the city. Similarly, they heard about Hittite. Like in the Bible, there is several times mention of people who are Hittites. And so they said, well, we don't find any Hittites, this must also have been fantasy. Now, just at that time, in Anatolia, they find inscriptions. Then a few years later, they also decipher them. It's a Sumerian script, but it's a different language. It turns out to be an Indo-European language. And this is Hittite. Now, moreover, some of the names of the heroes of Troy are understandable if you read them as Hittite. And so Hittites really existed. And then later their main cities were dug up and so on. So again, the tradition turned out to be right. Well, so here the same thing comes. So to say, you see, these epics are all fantasy, that's superseded. That's obsolete. You see, the people who say that in India think that, oh, we are rational, we are progressive, and these ugly, vicious Hindus, you see, they don't understand it. No, you see, the tradition in this case is, has a part of the truth. So the skeptics say it is all fantasy. By contrast, you see, with skeptics there's little to discuss. I mean, they say it's not true, and that's the end of it. The traditionalists, they take it all literally. And so, you see, they can come up with any line from the epics of the Puranas and use that as evidence. Look, it is written like this, so it must be like this. And us historians say it was mixed, like the histories of Herodotus. And that means, of course, a big burden of research work for us to sort of sift what is reliable, what is, you know, added later on, when was it added, why was it added, and so on. No. Yes. So our position is that the core of the epics is definitely true. So in the long king lists with which India distinguishes itself, you see, as many pro-India Western historians have remarked, India was great in every field except history. You see, when you study China's history, of every big event you have the exact date. And in India, you know, you have 5th century or maybe 4th century, and we don't know. You know, so in a sense, you see, it's quite a failure. Yet, then again, it has the king lists that go back farthest. And these king lists, you see, they laugh at them in the case of India. But in the case of Mesopotamia and Egypt, you could never have written a history of these regions without their local king lists. They're an extremely important source of history. It's also logical because in those cultures, this preserving of the name was extremely important. You know, as a famous Indo-European expression says, Kleos aftiton, or in Sanskrit, Shravas axitam, undying fame. This is what all the kings went for, undying fame. That's why they spent money on keeping a few poets employed to sing their praises, and ideally in a very pleasing form, so that their poems, their songs, would be remembered and repeated by the people generation after generation. So if they were to die, at least their name would live on. So these king lists were handled with great care. And so in especially the Puranas, there is a lot of things that you can't really consider historical. The most historical, the most certainly historical part are the king lists. So in the king list of the solar dynasty, you have Rama. In that of the Yadava branch of the lunar dynasty, you have Krishna. You have, of course, first of all, the Vedic rishis. You have Bharata, the founder of the Vedas. And so you see, that is all historical, and that can more or less be situated vis-a-vis one another. So that list was historical. And then some, you know, the basic events, the sort of skeleton of events, that is very much historical. So a war of succession in a royal dynasty is a very common thing in world history. So it also affected at one point the Bharata dynasty. Now, what does the rest consist of? You see, what is less historical? Now, first of all, you have embellishments, exaggerations, supernatural interpretations of events, or additions, you know, where supernatural elements are added that weren't there originally and that aren't really necessary for the story, but that make it, you know, more pleasing, or that may help explain something that otherwise would be hard to understand in those circumstances. Then, you know, this is really a hard test for historians. You have historical episodes, but that are not about the history that the epic is about. And so in the Mahabharata you have a number of examples. So you have this war of succession in the Bharata dynasty, which is at a particular date. You see, given my discussion with Nilesh Oak, I will not go into that today. There is a discussion between him and me available on YouTube if you care to look it up. But so here you see the exact date is not important. But what is important is that at that date we have this episode of the War of Succession with the Kurukshetra battle. But we have other events that are also mentioned in there. Like, we have mention of the Yavanas, the Romakas, the Chinas. Now you see, the Romakas were known only in India around the time of Christ, the Greeks a few centuries earlier, but not as early as the Mahabharata battle. The Chinas, you see, the name China has been created in China only in about 230 BC. So then it took some time before it reached India, and so it was definitely very much too late to be at the time of the Mahabharata war. In the Mahabharata war you have mention of the Cholas, the Pandyas and so on, dynasties that flourished, well, at least 1,000 years after the Mahabharata war. So these dynasties are very much historical, and some events that are described are historical. In some cases we know that they were definitely not of the time of the Mahabharata. In other cases there is room for doubt. For example, Krishna fights a war with Jarasandha from Magadha. Now at that time apparently Jarasandha is a great powerful imperialist. Where do we know this from? You see, in the life of the Buddha, which is about 500 BC, very much after the Kurukshetra battle, we do find mention of a pressure that is exerted by Magadha on the neighboring republics, the Vajji Republic, the Licchavis. And so we see at that time the Magadha kingdom expanding. And so this will lead to the creation of the Nanda Empire, then finally an almost all-Indian Maurya Empire. Now, did this happen at the time of Krishna? I am not so sure. It's not impossible, but you see, for that period we know very little about the northeast. We only know this Vedic area in the northwest. So here, I leave it open. It is something to be investigated. Then you have elements about the individuals where, if you read a report about an event, probably you're not going to know these details. It depends a bit on what kind of medium you're dealing with. If it's some social magazine, probably they're going to give attention to the fact that some person in some situations shed tears or had a laugh or whatever. Otherwise, you're not going to hear about it. You're going to only hear the events. Like here, for example, Rama liberates Sita. Now, you see, feminist critics make a lot of the fact that he's quite cold against her. He says, you do what you want. You see, I liberated you, I defeated my enemy, that's what counted for me. Now, you see, I think humanly this is what a man in that situation might do. You see, for years he has fought to get her back, he has fought to defeat Ravana. Then finally it succeeds. Now, first of all, we know from experience that when people have been heavily longing for something and then they get it, typically they fall into an abyss. They get depressed. And here in particular, you see, he's wondering, what has happened to her in the meantime? Has she fallen in love with Ravana? Maybe he's better in bed than I am? Or something. I mean, he has his doubts. And so that's why he reacts by taking his distance from her. Then later, of course, they make up. But for an initial reaction, I think the description in the Ramayana is quite realistic. And so the people who say with Audrey Truschke that Rama was a misogynist pig, I think they just don't understand much of, human psychology. Then we get the really serious part, namely the insertion of ideological distortions. And here the famous example is the Shambhuka episode. You see, in the Ramayana, initially, caste is no issue at all. They never speak about it. Rama freely fraternizes with the Vanaras, the probably tribals or so. And then suddenly he hears, he doesn't even know much about it. Somebody tells him that this Brahmin boy has died because of some caste transgression, and he goes there and he asks no question, just, and then he immediately gets rewarded from heaven. You see, flower petals are rained down upon him and so on. So, it is not far-fetched to see this as a later interpolation from the time when caste has become an important feature of Hindu society, which initially it wasn't. And so then you see the later editors try to fortify this new ideology by invoking the authority of no less a person than Rama for this new institution that Rama himself never knew. There are cases where you don't really know. An example also in the caste sphere is Draupadi, who, spurns the attempts by Karna to go to compete for her hand in her Swayamvara, won by Arjuna, because she thinks he's of low caste. She doesn't know that he's actually a brother of Arjuna, and most people then don't know. But so, for caste reasons, she spurns him. At least that's the reading that the final editors give to it. Was this there in the original or not? Interesting question. Then you have the overlay of mythical elements. Now here there's something strange. These mythical elements usually don't come after the fact. You see, the fact happens, people try to make sense of the event, and then it dawns on them, oh yeah, this is something similar to that myth that we already know. For example, in the Mahabharata, it happens twice that somebody becomes almost immune, almost invulnerable, thanks to some magical act, namely Duryodhana can become invincible, no, not invincible, at least invulnerable, by exposing himself naked to the gaze of his mother, who has worn a blindfold for most of her life. So he does so, but Krishna convinces him that, this is no manners, to appear naked before your mother, at least wear loincloth. And so he does so, and then that's where later he gets killed. Then Krishna himself gets some kind of a balm, or how do you call it, something, unction, or how do you call this? It's not my world. That's smeared over him by sage Durvasa. And so this again makes him invulnerable. Unfortunately, while he is undergoing this treatment, he is standing on his feet. So the soles of his feet have not become invulnerable, and that's later where a hunter by mistake shoots him. Now we know this. This storyline is much older than the Mahabharata or even than the Rig Veda. It goes back to at least Proto-Indo-European. And itself, you see, Proto-Indo-European is also the daughter of older languages. That far we can't see, but we know this story because it appears also in Greek and Germanic mythology. From the Greek, you certainly know the story of Achilles. You know, when he is born, his mother dips him in a magic potion, but she holds him by his heel. So that's why his heel remains vulnerable, the Achilles heel, and that's where he gets killed. Then among the Germanic people, you have Balder, who wants to become invulnerable by getting all the plants to promise that any weapon made out of them will not hurt him. But you see, he doesn't get the promise from the mistletoe because he thinks, you know, it's too weak a type of plant, it's not hard enough to serve to make a weapon. And so then you see one of the gods on some occasions shoots him with an arrow made of mistletoe, and that kills him. And then finally, Siegfried, the dragon slayer, you see, after he's killed the dragon, he bathes himself in the blood of the dragon, and that makes him invulnerable. But an oak leaf falls on his shoulder, and so there he isn't invulnerable, and there later he gets killed. So we have here a common mythological motive that reappears in the Mahabharata. So I don't think that that was created, you know, in interpreting later the events of the Mahabharata, that was a mythological motive that was quite well known, and that the poets saw, you know, saw it as logical to impose that on that particular episode. Right. So this little explanation remains. I mean, here I have the impression that few people will have a need for this explanation, but I can assure you that there are quite a few who still stick to the inerrancy of Scripture. You see, if there are any people here from the southern United States, they will certainly know the concept of inerrancy of Scripture. You see, that's in Christianity the idea that the Bible is completely right. If you think there's anything wrong, it's that you haven't thought hard enough, because if you think hard enough, you will find a way in which this is true. So I think that the Scripture does not have that kind of perfection. It is very much a human product. So, what does the West have to offer in studies of Hindu scriptures? So if the Orientalist intrusion has been good for something, it is to introduce the notion of change. And so this, for quite a few people, this is a very difficult notion, because they think that the whole tradition has been exactly as it is. Strictly speaking, they only say that about the Vedas. They say the Vedas is a revealed scripture, just like the Quran, and it exists already since creation or even before. It has always been like that, it has always been the same. It is, of course, a complete misunderstanding of scripture to bring it down to something as ordinary as history. So there are no human events in the Vedas. That's why you have, for instance, Arya Samaj translations of the Vedas, where systematically every name of a place or a river or so is given some symbolic interpretation, because they don't want this to be soiled with, you know, geographical or historical features. So you see, even for the Mahabharata, for the Shastras especially, you know, this belief in unchangingness is quite there. And even though the Shastras themselves make a provision for change. You see, at the end of the Manusmriti, it is said in so many words, well, you know, if some scholar well-versed in the spirit of the laws, sees a need to change the letter of the law, he can do that. And so you see the notion of change is already there, and you know, if ever you land in some debate with Muslims about the Sharia and so on, and so they use the Manu Smriti against you, you know, it's important to point to that. In the case of the Sharia, no change is possible. Whereas in the Manu Smriti, that provision is there. So it's not only that modern Hindus, you see, they have a distance towards scripture, they change it. You know, there you might say, yeah, but that's not really Hindu. You know, they are sinning against Hinduism, whatever that may be, even though that's what they're doing. No, you see, this is already provided for in Hinduism. So it's not that rigid. Nevertheless, this idea that it's, you know, eternal and unchanging is quite common. Hinduism had come to be a little bit frozen about its own tradition, unchanging. And so what is very common is that it back projected its current beliefs onto the past. This is what I call, but I'm not the first to call it that, an invented tradition. This term comes from a British Marxist in the 1980s, and what he meant was that very many so-called traditions are in fact quite recent and are falsely presented as traditional. So I'm afraid that to some extent something like that is happening here. Let's see a few examples. The Vedas are very often, and in most introductory books already, described as apaurushaya. They are not created by a purusha, a person. They are impersonal. So this is interpreted as supernatural. Now, strictly speaking, the word apaurushaya you could translate differently. If you, let's say, write an autobiographical novel, that is very paurushaya, that's very personal. By contrast, if you take a physics textbook about the law of gravity and so on, to the number of Avogadro and all that, that's very impersonal. Everything that's described in there is also true in another galaxy. You know, it's universal, it's eternal. So that you could, strictly speaking, call apaurushaya, and you could carry the message, well, actually the Vedas are to be understood like that. They are of universal validity. In that sense, they are apaurushaya. Okay, that I can live with. But the idea that they are revealed scripture, that is emphatically untrue. You see, it is claimed for the Quran, and the Quran claims it about itself, but not the Vedas. You see, the Vedic rishis are quite emphatic that it is they themselves who have composed the hymns. You can see this in the Vedic hymns themselves, like the very first, you know, 111, the first mandala, first sukta, first mantra says, Om Agnim Ile, I worship the fire. You know, and in the Mrityunjaya mantra, we worship the three-eyed one. And in the Gayatri mantra, let the sun god, you know, stimulate our minds. So it's always human beings who are addressing the gods. Or sometimes who are speaking about the gods in the third person, but never in the first person. You see them do very human things, like you have a number of dana stutis in the Rig Veda, which means that they are expressing gratitude to their sponsors. Now, does God need a sponsor? The human beings, yes, we know in the cultural sector, all the painters and sculptors and poets and so on, they are constantly on the lookout for somebody who will keep them alive. Of many ancient painters and poets and so on, the main literature that we still have is their begging letters to dukes and bishops and so on to sponsor them. So this is what the Vedic rishis also did. There are quotes in the Rig Veda where you see one sukta quotes from another, or the Atharva Veda quotes from the Rig Veda and so on. Does God do any quoting? Quoting is what you do when you invoke a higher authority. Does God have a higher authority? So my favorite simile for the spirit in which the rishis wrote this is like a young man who is enamored of a girl, and he goes to her balcony bringing his guitar and he's singing a serenade. Oh, you're so beautiful. Your eyes are as deep as the ocean, hoping that the girl will be impressed and return the favor. Now, of course, the girl is not going to tell him beforehand, hey, you have to say that my eyes are so deep as the ocean, you know. Hey, that's slightly ridiculous. And so here also you see Agni and Brahaspati and Varuna and so on. They are not telling human beings what to say to praise them. You know, that praise comes from the human beings. There is also one case where after the battle of the 10 kings, Vasishtha praises himself. You know, he says it is thanks to the eminent quality of my poetry that Indra got swayed and got persuaded to come down, you know, in help of my employer Sudas. And that's why the battle was won. So there is absolutely no indication that this was dictated by the gods. It is very much a human work. Then the theory of the Chatur Yuga. You see the 4 yugas. On the one hand, it is very ancient. And again, it is pre-Vedic, it is Indo-European. You also find it in the Germanic and Greek systems. So in Germanic you have the spear age, sword age, wind age, and wolf age. And among the Greeks, you know, well known to you, you have the golden age, silver, bronze, and iron. And so the system is the same. The idea is that they are in declining order. The last one is the worst. However, what you don't find is that there is some numeral attached to them. Nobody is saying that the Dwapara Yuga is 864,000 years. And so when does that come? You see, the term Yuga is being used in the sense of an age, a measure of time, from, for as far as we know, the Vedanga Jyotisha and the contemporary Parashara Tantra, where it means a period of 5 years. Why 5 years? You see, a yuga means a cycle going from a conjunction, that's where the word yuga comes in, from a conjunction to the next conjunction. So in the case of sun and moon, it starts at new moon, it goes around, you know, full moon, waning moon, and then when it's a new moon, the cycle is complete, that's a month. Now, in this case, it is a cycle with not even a planetary cycle of 2 objects you can see in the sky. It's more abstract. It has to do with the period of the sun and the moon. So in the case of the sun, it is a year. In the case of the moon, it is a lunar month. But 12 months falls short of a full year. 11 days short, or if you take a 13th month, then it is 17 days extra. However, after 5 years, these two more coincide. So if you take 5 times 12 months, plus 2 leap months, plus 2 intercalary months, then you are more or less back at New Year. Your moon has caught up with the sun. So the 2 cycles coincide again. Not perfectly. A better approximation is 8 years, and an even better one is 19 years. So you have 7 leap months added, and then you're back to coinciding with the solar year. So these 5 years are used there as a yuga, and so that's a measure of time, and that's the longest yuga that exists till then. Then you get, of course, longer cycles. The longest one is the Jupiter-Saturn cycle of 20 years, or if you add the star with which they are in conjunction, then they meet at the same place after 3 cycles, so 60 years. So that's the longest cycle they know, and in both Chinese and Indian astronomy, you have a century of 60 years. However, in about 127, at any rate in the 2nd century BC, Hipparchus of Nicaea, working in Alexandria, discovers the precession cycle. You've heard about it just an hour ago in Nilesh's talk. So this is a cycle of almost 26,000 years. Now at that time when they freshly discovered it, of course the estimation was still a bit rough, and so to work with it they rounded it off to 24,000 years. And that's where it starts. So these 24,000 years were used as the largest cycle known to men at that time, and the 4 yugas were fitted into it. And this in their natural order, in the sense that the Krita Yuga was 4 times as long, the Treta 3 times, Dwapara 2 times, and Kali is the shortest one, 1 unit. So these are 10 units in total. So 1/2 of the cycle is divided into 10, such that the 4 first parts are Krita Yuga, 3 parts are Treta Yuga, 2 are Dwapara Yuga, and 1 is Kali Yuga. And then it ascends again. So you see a full cycle of approximately 24,000 years is divided in 2 halves, and in those 2 halves you get the cycle of the yugas. And so this is, I mean, by the time this reaches India, it's already into the Christian age. And then it's not over yet, because then Puranic poets or someone decide that this is a bit too pedestrian to address heaven, and so they attribute to heaven higher standards than to men, and they say that these periods are to be read as not human years but divine years. And they say that what is a year for a man is only a day for God. So all these figures have to be multiplied by 360. And so a cycle of 24,000 years, half is 12,000 years, 1/10 of that is 1,200 years. That's the original length of the Kali Yuga, a system that is ascribed to the seer Markandeya. But so now it gets multiplied by 360, and then you get these unwieldy numbers, like 1,200 times 360 is 432,000. And so there you get these, unwieldy yugas, and so they create all kinds of strange problems, like you know, if it is literarily attested that Rama lived in the Treta Yuga and Krishna only at the end of the Dwapara Yuga, that means that there is a whole Dwapara Yuga between them. So there is more than 864,000 years between them. So Rama lived in like 900,000 years ago. So I don't think so. I think there are many archaeological and so on reasons against this. But so this is very common, and you know, I think it is possible to return to the original meaning without too much damage. You see, that's the funny thing about this, let's say, rational approach, that if you use that rational approach to evaluate the basic doctrines of Christianity or of Islam, they can't survive. You see, they are not compatible with the scientific temper. Whereas in the case of Hinduism, I'm afraid that there is some dead wood that can't be saved, that will have to be given up, that will have to be recognized as, you know, just some imaginative exaggeration, but that the essence is very much untouched. So you see, going through a bit of a difficult time, and you're through most of it anyway, is worth it, because your self-declared enemies are going to suffer far more seriously. Another point, and that I don't want to go too deeply into it, but that is caste. So in the ancient scriptures there's no caste. You know, that's like a very central point in the Arya Samaj teachings, that in the Vedas there was no caste. We are in favor of the Vedas. We spurn all these later writings that are caste-ridden. And so that's a coherent view. It just so happens that there is no caste in the Vedas, not even in the Purusha Sukta. You see what you have in the Purusha Sukta? First of all, you have something totally universal. So in this case, don't flatter, and don't blame yourself for this being typically Hindu. You see, the missionaries are going to say, how evil you are with this Purusha Sukta. Well, first of all, it is not at all typically Hindu. You have, you know, it starts with a myth about the unity of the whole. First, the universe as a whole. So you have a very common myth among the Germanics, even among the Chinese, among the Mayas in Mexico. You have this very common myth of a body that is divided into parts, and then they become the universe. The skull becomes the heavenly vault, you know, the soles of the feet become the earth, the bones become the mountains, the blood becomes the rivers, the eyes become the sun and the moon, like that. And in the Chinese version it is even added, the lice on his skin become the human beings. See, you see, modern deep ecologists, you know, they claim that human beings are a sort of vermin on the skin of Mother Earth. Well, they were not the first. Okay, so that's one. And then there's a second universe, so to speak, namely society. And on society you can apply the same reasoning, namely that the thinkers are the head of society, and the doers, they are the arms of society, and you know, the supporters are the feet of society. I mean, this is all very logical, you know. And so this is not at all typically Hindu. On the contrary. In 499, about 500 BC, a Roman aristocrat called Menenius Agrippa has to conduct negotiations with a rebellious lower class. And so they say this is unfair, you know, that you people have all the privileges of the, you know, the powerful, and we don't, and we want the same, and so on. And so he explains, but, you know, look, you know, a body, you know, all the parts of the body are different. The eye is doing something else than the stomach, is doing something else than the foot. you know, and they all need each other. They all need to do exactly their own thing. That's what they're, you know, good for all the others. And so, you see, if everybody does well, you know, what he was made for, then everything will go well. Everybody will profit. That same story was used 500 years later by somebody you will probably know, a Roman citizen of Jewish origin, namely Saint Paul, who is more or less the founder of Christianity. So he uses that same story. Then, in the late 19th century, when socialism was coming up with its doctrine of class struggle, the church pitted against that the harmony model, and they used the same imagery. You see, that's why their doctrine was called corporatism. That is to say, using the body as a model. And that is still the official, you know, social teaching of the church. So that's not at all typically Hindu. Nevertheless, it is very much there in Hinduism. So, what do you want to say? Does this support the caste system or not? Well, no. What it supports is the differentiation of society in 4 layers, which is true of more or less every complex society. It's only the absolutely primitive hunter-gatherers where everybody is more or less equal. And so there you get a specialization. Now, how are these different classes recruited? That is not said at all. It is not said that you have to do the same profession as your father. There is no professional heredity. And it is not at all said that you have to marry somebody from the same community. So the 2 distinctive properties of caste, namely hereditary profession and endogamy, are not present in the Purusha Sukta. Now, it is true that later generations of Hindus, looking for justification for the then emerging caste system, then latch on to this, you know, this Vedic reference, hoping that they can make it mean caste system. Yeah, so today Hindu apologists are reversing this discourse, interestingly. So for 2,000 years thereabouts, because the caste system in full dates from about 100, 200 AD, so less than 2,000 years ago. So there is much of Hindu history that has no caste. So for that long, Hindus have been trying to justify caste with this Purusha Sukta or with the Bhagavad Gita. And so, you see in the Bhagavad Gita it is said that caste is determined by guna and karma. Now, for very long people have said, but these are jati, I mean, these are birth-based. You see, if you are tall, no, if your father is tall, then you are probably also going to be tall. You see, guna is hereditary. If your mother is black, you are also going to be at least half black, or, you know, darker than your father, and so on. I mean, so you could say guna is hereditary, karma likewise. You see, your father is a craftsman. Before you get your puberty crisis saying, no, I don't want to do the same as my father, you are already an accomplished craftsman, because you've learned it at home. And so you could say even karma is hereditary. Now, I don't say it is, but you see, this has been a very common interpretation among Hindus. And now the latest generations, there has been a reversal. And they say, see, Krishna never says caste is by birth, it is by guna and karma. Or a final example, the story of Satyakam Javala. The one who wants to become a pupil of a guru, and so he has to say who he is, which is in the first place to say who his father was or is. And so he goes, asks his mother, and the mother says, well, sorry, I've been a maid in a number of rich families, you know, I've been to bed with all these landlords, and I don't know who your father is. And so he admits this to the Guru. He says, sorry, I don't know. And so the Guru says, well, this means you're very truthful. You don't try to, make some excuse story. You say it as it is. See, you are truth-loving. Now, many Hindus will say today that, this proves that only truthfulness matters. Your birth caste doesn't matter. Now, the traditional interpretation is just the opposite. They say, well, since you are truthful, this proves that your father must have been a Brahmin. You see, there they apply the logic of caste by birth. And so, yeah, you can see it both ways, So, I mean, this is a nice discussion, and I don't think this really determines it one way or the other. But at any rate, you see, this is one instance where old texts can be manipulated by later editors. A last example is horoscopic astrology. So there exists something like Vedic astrology. We recently had an example of it, the consecration of the Rama temple. First, you see, there was the Bhumi Pujan some 3 years ago, and there, astrologers protested that they had done it at the wrong time, namely during the waning moon. And so they said, you see, the rule is that if you want an enterprise to prosper, you have to start it on the waxing moon.